In August 2024, UBS Global Wealth Management Vice Chairman Mike Ryan joined us at the MoneyShow MoneyMasters Symposium, Las Vegas, to share strategies for investing in a fractious international environment.
It starts with the notion of income and wealth inequality, which, by the way, has existed in every society since time immemorial. There have always been haves and have-nots. There's always been a disparity of wealth. I do think several things have happened that have made those issues more acute and more serious. The first is that concentration of wealth has increased. You've all heard these statistics, and I'm going to bore you with it, but I think it does help illustrate just the magnitude of this concentration. Back in 1978, the top 0.1% of the population owned 7% of all wealth. Currently, it's over 30%. So we're seeing this incredible concentration of wealth. What we're seeing at the same time is increased economic insecurity, especially in lower income earners. They felt besieged on many fronts. Their economic security is being challenged. Remember, many of them have faced the loss of traditional private sector safety nets. And what do I mean by that? Look, we know the public safety net, it's Social Security, it's Medicare, it's Medicaid, it is those programs that those haven't necessarily changed. What has changed, though, is the private safety nets, which include the family.
Following his participation in a panel discussion on the markets, I sat down with Mike to get more details about what his worldview was and how investors should adapt to this changing environment. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike. Great to be here.
A lot of people loved what you had to say here. Great presentation, so thank you for that. If we can briefly, for people who weren't able to watch you live, talk about the four main points that you think are driving this market and economic environment.
So the way I view this is that every secular cycle has many different trends or drivers, right? So there's almost an infinite amount of things you can focus on. But I think there are four that are really consequential that we need to think about. The first is what I define as geopolitical fracturing. And this is the notion that we lived through this period where, at the end of the Cold War, we saw this sort of, what I'll say, the coming together of the world. Barriers to trade fell. You said a divide between free market and authoritarian governments fell. You saw increasing multilateral cooperation, and it really was an extraordinary period defined by, incredible wealth being created, poverty rates plummeted to historic lows. You had fewer fatalities in conflict than any time in U.S. history. Trade expanded exponentially, and importantly, you also saw the embrace of Western values becoming global norms. That meant then that democratic process became the norm. The problem is that I think that's ended now. And we now entered this much more fractious geopolitical environment, and therefore it means now that the world is becoming a more contentious place. There are competitors emerging to the US, there's alternative views of how the world order should work, and I think what you're going to see now is a much more frictioned world where cooperation is going to be harder to come by, new alliances will form, there will be trade relationships will evolve, they'll become narrower and more focused geographically, and then lastly I think what you also see is new threats or adversaries will emerge that will challenge, especially places like the United States. So that's the first one. The second one is what I call social factioning, and I have to sometimes explain that. Factioning is literally people separating into factions. And you think about it, for most of our lives, or at least my life, we thought of ourselves, our identity was born by being Americans. The institutions we had reinforced that, whether it was educational institutions, government itself, religious entities, this sort of reinforced our identity. What you've seen is the faith or the confidence in those institutions has declined, and what you're seeing a polarization, and I'd say almost an alienation across society. So we're seeing not only the frictions across borders that happens in geopolitics, but within borders from a social dimension where you're seeing more identity politics, people are separating into camps of increased tribalism, and it's leading then to sort of this split and this continued dividing within countries. I think the third element is what I call economic calcification. And look, the world has always been an unequal place. There's always been disparities in wealth. There have been haves and have-nots. That has existed since time immemorial. I suspect we're not going to cure that or solve that in our lifetime. However, one of the things we've always had is economic mobility. Where you started wasn't where you ended. I use the example of myself. My father was a construction worker. I became chief investment officer and vice chairman at UBS. So my outcome or where my destination wasn't defined by where I began. I think what you're seeing now is this calcification means that there's less of that economic mobility. There's a lot of predetermination of where you start is where you end. And it means then we're seeing almost perpetually entrenched underclasses. And I think that breeds social resentment. The last dynamic is the one that I think we've heard most about more recently, and that's this notion of technological transformation, what I call technology factoring. And it's most apparent in what we've seen is this absolute explosion in AI and machine learning, but it's not limited to that. It's also synthetic biology and quantum computing. And this is a truly transformational application of technology that will yield exponential rates of change. We are linear thinkers, Mike. We tend to think of things happening incrementally. This will be change that will be driven exponentially, and it will be incredibly disruptive from a political, geopolitical, macroeconomic, commercial, and social dimensions. It will create enormous opportunities, but it also create some consequences. And I think we're only at the beginning of this process, and I don't think we have a grasp yet on exactly how profound this change will be, but we better get a grasp on it and get an understanding of it because it's going to have such a huge impact, and especially in investment markets.
I know, but with your last point there first, I found it really interesting. You had mentioned that none of us really understand where this thing is going, and it can go down this very positive track or a negative track, and we just have to try and ride it as best as possible, right?
Well, I'll use an example about how we think something will play out, and I think it's a great example: the internal combustion engine. So when the internal combustion engine was first developed, the view was that this would be a supplemental source of power, fixed site power, that this would be sort of a way of generating power. When it was first originated, the architects of it never envisioned this being a form of locomotion. But think about it, the internal combustion engine now has become such a profound game changer, and so its primary application was not envisioned when the technology first developed. We have to think of similar pathways for AI and machine learning. We may think we know how it'll go out, but the way it will progress and the way it will evolve will be very different from our original conception of it.
Yeah, absolutely. We're here at an investment conference. You talked about some of the implications, maybe some, from a strategic level or an asset allocation level. I think one of the interesting things you talked about was that maybe a little bit more of a demand for safety and things like defense that are going to prosper or do better in this environment, yes?
Well, first of all, I think when you have more geopolitical friction and you have this increasingly polarized world, I think therefore it means there's a higher risk of conflict. There's certainly higher risk of disruption. When you have more competing interests, when you enter that kind of moving away from what we consider to be the unipolar world to a more multipolar or multi-complex world, there's different agendas, there's different priorities. And therefore, that could lead to greater, as I said before, friction that results in conflict. So I have to understand now that there will be more potential hotspots around the world from a geopolitical standpoint, and I have to prepare for that. So a couple of ways of doing that is making sure I have safe haven assets, more balanced portfolios. Fixed income will play a prominent role going forward. So you can't predict where geopolitics will play out. It's impossible to forecast. So you have to prepare for it, as I said before, by having more balanced portfolios that include safe haven assets.
Got it. One other thing you had mentioned was national champions, companies that in this sort of multipolar world are going to have more government support in some industries or some locations. Can you expand on that point a little bit?
So if you think about this era what we lived through from, let's say, 1989 through 2015, this was the era of globalization. This was where the barriers to trade, collapsed, where capital and goods and services flowed across borders as the ideas did. And it really was the domain of multinationals and what I call the global power brands. It's because, when there's less friction globally, people gravitate to the things that interest them the most or have the most appeal. When you have this increased friction, suddenly you become more focused on national brand. You focus more on, okay, what's in our borders? You become a little more, I won't use the word xenophobic, but I will say you become a little more domestically focused in terms of your priorities. And therefore you promote national brands. So I think these national champions then, both through policy and through preference of consumers, are going to play an increasingly important role in the world we see, this more fractious geopolitical world.
Understood. I guess in the last minutes that we have left, any parting advice? Again, as we're recording this, we've had more geopolitical issues. We're kind of questions about what the Fed's going to do, what it means for the economy. Any final thoughts on that?
Look, I mentioned those four trends, and there's a whole host of other things that are impacting. One you just sort of alluded to, and that's policy. we went through an era where policy played such a dominant role in the aftermath both of the financial crisis and COVID. I think the biggest challenge and the process we have to go through now is how does the world readjust as policy becomes less prominent, as it comes to dominate outcomes less so. And how do we do it? Because we become so dependent upon it. So I think obviously now the Fed beginning the process of, as we believe in September, pivoting and cutting rates. But after this extensive tightening cycle, and then as fiscal policy becomes less supportive because the stimulus package are all worn off, we have to understand now that policy is in a dynamic where it's no longer going to be uniformly and consistent positive for economic growth and financial markets.
Excellent. Well, Mike, thank you again for taking some time out here. Hope you enjoy the rest of the show.
Thanks, Mike.